During Disney Pixar's first 15 years of feature-length releases, that's their first 10 films, they only sought the talents of 3 composers, and 2 of them were cousins. After much acclaim for Finding Nemo, what was Pixar's first break from Randy, the Thomas of the Newmans was brought back on board for 2008's WALL-E, at that point Pixar's most expensive picture yet. Having modernized Pixar's sonic landscape somewhat, he returned with a number of innovative new textures. However, instead of the blissful open oceans, Newman was tasked with scoring an ecological dystopia, space traversal, and an overwhelmingly sincere but ironically very human love story. As we know, WALL-E, the titular protagonist, is a friendly and dutiful robot whose sole responsibility is the cleanup of Earth's pervasive waste problem. Earth is long abandoned by its human polluters for an off-world utopia who are now kept pacified by servant robots.
Over here.
And kept content with their now meaningless existence in space. In suitably referential Pixar style, WALL-E gifts the Hollywood literate in the audience with nods to film music past, with humorous quotations from 2001: A Space Odyssey for its moments of human exploration and triumph. However, more fundamentally, WALL-E uses several numbers from 1969's musical film and Broadway show Hello, Dolly as a central narrative motivation and driver of emotion in a robotic character. Writers Stanton and Reardon effectively borrow a sense of longing for broadened horizons from the characters in Hello, Dolly. Even those with no prior knowledge of the plot from the musical can still know these themes from the lyrical narrative that we're hearing over the opening of the film. It acts as a textual quotation to evoke a wistful, innocent, vicarious nostalgia. And this nostalgia is not purely aesthetic, it's functional too. By referencing a text that's perceived as quaint and nostalgic for both WALL-E's and our periods in time, it prompts the audience to long for a return to a more simplistic version of ourselves that predates this very real apocalyptic threat of our present, emotionally and sentimentally willing us to avoid it. It also instills a sense of innocence as we see WALL-E's look of wonder in his lenses. Together with WALL-E, we long for a return to a simple, optimistic, childlike outlook where we can confidently leave the world a better place. The bittersweetness of the moment underscores the very real knowledge that we may already be on a path whose end result could be analogous to the future WALL-E is presenting to us. Hello, Dolly's composer, the late Jerry Herman, was notably delighted by the use of his music in WALL-E. He was quoted as saying, "I was so thrilled and moved. What a wonderful use to show a desolate world contrasted with the joy of those lyrics." Now, Herman is addressing 2 distinct devices to carry meaning here. There is the primary recontextualization of the prior text, but also its anempathetic use in its new context. This contrast, as he calls it, enhances the negative with a juxtaposition with the positive. In this case, the desolation of the world that we see is amplified by the levity of the music that we hear. This is potentially a very strong emotive device in composition, but is equally effective here in quotation. Much has been said about the film's commendable ability to retain a child's attention for the first 30-plus dialogue-free minutes, though admittedly the film does predate the iPad. The animation, story, art direction, all of course have very strong claims to its success despite this lack of dialogue, but another forerunner for this achievement is absolutely Newman's music. After a brief, intriguing juxtaposition of Hello, Dolly's very light music with the establishing shots of ecological ruin, Newman's ominous descending harp arpeggios begin playing over a minor to major modulation in the string choir, which gives us a suitable sense of unease. We begin to see that a single corporation has monopolized food, transportation, energy, even the world economy, and that its CEO is a de facto world leader, perhaps the world leader. Ominously, we also see that the by and large corporation has a monopoly on our salvation, both in charge of the evidently futile cleanup operation.
Too much garbage in your face? There's
There's plenty of space out in space.
And they also own the ships where humanity now lives. Further wide shots of the ruinous landscape are accompanied by swelling, lamenting strings, playing an ascending and descending chromatic line. The chromaticism here, or the semitonal movement, is devoid of a diatonic key center, so enhances that unease and ominousness. The first of Newman's own musical juxtapositions occurs as we see an advertisement for the By and Large Corporation's Axiom flagship and its plush, bountiful living standards off-world, while the strings are playing a tonally ambiguous sequence of major chords, descending down a major third each time. This sense that something is not quite right between what we're seeing and what we're hearing is effective in foreshadowing a problem with the axiom specifically, and it's mirrored in a similar harmonic device as Wally approaches the axiom for the first time. The cue, aptly titled The Axiom, that takes Wally and us away from the Earth for the first time, has a meandering tonality that gives us so much harmonic richness and variety in what would otherwise be a silent scene out of space. In a very simplified view of things, tonal modulation tends to occur between adjacent degrees on the circle of fifths, whose key differences only have a single note, sharp or flat difference from one to the other. For example, C major with no sharps or flats can move one to the right on the circle of fifths for a new key of G major with just a single F sharp, or it can move left 1 degree to F major with just a single B flat. But in this cue, we initially move from C sharp major to C major. And though that only sounds like a semitonal modulation, it's actually every note within the key that moves a semitone. So this very small leap has a very rich sonic impact to describe the new scale of these celestial bodies that Wally is seeing for the first time in outer space. We get there by a leading chord of G major, fifth chord of the new C major key. Now, use of the fifth chord is a common modulating tactic, but here it comes immediately after the fifth chord of the old key of C sharp major, a G sharp major chord. So again, a very chromatic non-tonal leap, which is saved only by the B natural being played in the melody, the major seventh degree of the new key, or the major third of the G major. That leading B natural helps solidify the validity of the key change, and is also a semitonal direction up in the melody during a semitone movement down in the harmony. So this widening has a kind of grandiose effect, again describing the scale of his new setting. The completion of the modulation now on that rich low C major chord is kept right up until we see the image of Wally in front of the sun, of course the largest object that it could be describing. On his approach to the ship, we hear a subtle tumbling of major chords, again just as we did with the advertisement, this time descending in tone intervals to modulate to a new key center of B flat major. These tumbling chords start on a similarly semitonal move to an F sharp major from a G major, and because of the relative tonal incompatibility of these chords, it's almost like we're shifting it to a new key center with each chord change, finally resting down on that B flat major. We hear a brass fanfare on solo horn. And it's almost a call and response between that solo horn and the full brass choir playing fortissimo. Demonstrating the relative insignificance of Wally's courage against the gigantic magnitude of the Axiom ship. Solo horn fanfare as heroism and courage, of course, is a well-established trope with all of its militaristic connotations. And it also accompanies the captain's eventual approach uprising against the mutinous autopilot. We hear an overlaid major-minor chord dissonance as well in the brass choir, as the ambiguous, duplicitous nature of the axiom's true purpose is signified very early on. Major-minor dissonances, with their notes clashing against their close neighbours, can convey a real tension in the coming together of opposing ideas, or, as Newman puts it himself very simply, drama.
All those dissonances, those haunting tones or surprise notes.
Just a sense of complex drama, maybe, kind of trying to acknowledge that the drama is not one thing, but many things.
Being primarily a family-oriented animated feature, though not without its darker real-world themes, there's a wonderful levity in the score. Heavily reverberated flutes are used by Newman across his body of work, but are used in WALL-E and indeed in Finding Nemo to signify a contentedness or a subtle sense of awe and wonder.
Wow.
Yes, Marlin, I see it.
He also uses bass guitar in a number of cues, most notably here in the cue Foreign Contaminant, in a style reminiscent of Tony Levin, bassist for Peter Gabriel, who wrote and performed the title track for the film, plays a rapid tapping motif with a very unique texture played again in quite a chromatic way. The quick tempo and the very transient timbre of each individual tapped note conveys almost a busy flock of sounds, mirroring the hordes of robot technicians and the precision and the rapidity of their tasks. Narrative themes of agency and self-determination permeate WALL-E's interactions with these new strangers aboard the Axiom, both robotic and human alike. Newman frequently writes passages pizzicato to attain an air of mischief in certain interactions, like when WALL-E bestows the cleaning robot with free will. Or when he invites a guard robot to contemplate the act of waving. Accompaniment from staccato winds only works to reinforce the lightness here, and the harmonic allusions in these passages suggest a dominant seventh chord. Another Newman staple. Dominant seventh chords have a strong, tense sound that is often used to create a sense of anticipation, and they can be used to create a sense of urgency or excitement in the music. This audible theme of playfulness extends beyond the score and into the sound design. WALL-E's many robots and machines all hold their distinct sonic identities. Sound design and music composition can be heavily intertwined disciplines, particularly in the modern scoring era, as digital technology and synthesis continues to permeate both. Though Newman only incorporates a few sound design elements into his score directly, there is a much more fundamental discipline for a composer to master. Spotting is the act of a composer and usually a director or producer together deciding the specific moments that music will enter and depart, and some idea of what the music should be evoking or how it should be moving. WALL-E's initial meeting with the robots actually has no score at all. The absence of music allows the awkward tension of the meeting to come to the forefront, and space is expertly carved out for us to appreciate the character direction with all of its physical comedy and the richness of the diegetic sound design. Diegetic sounds are any sounds whose source is within the world that we're seeing on screen. The emphasis on the wider non-musical sound world can be incredibly immersive. If the breadth and quality of the sound design is known at the time of spotting, this could easily and with great impact influence the choices for the music's presence and absence. One of WALL-E's most iconic scenes is the dance with Eve in outer space. The aptly named cue Define Dancing is largely an elaboration on Eve's earlier introductory theme, and it opens with harps moving between major chords a tone apart. Harp, signifying the delicate interplay of romance, is a convention as old as Cupid's bow or liar, and although these obvious signifiers can become contrived or saccharine, it's used here with subtlety and sincerity. Harp is also audible every time Wally focuses on Eve's hand, longing to hold it, and for her to want to hold it in return. The hand-holding gesture, and therefore the sonic association, is repeated throughout the film, with its final resolution taking place at the end of the film, where Wally's memory is returned. For writer-director Stanton, this action is an incredibly important conveyor of emotion in the film, transcending the language and species barriers for both robot and human characters, and indeed the human audience. For Wally's 10th anniversary, he told Entertainment Weekly, "I had read a book in the mid-90s by this guy that was a major observer of human poses and gestures, and one of the things that is common all around the world in every culture to show affection is holding hands. And I just felt like there could be nothing more powerful in a movie where the dialogue was foreign to everybody, but that's how he was figuring out what love was." Harp, in this moment, solidifies its device as a carrier of romantic meaning and intent, as it also scores the burgeoning romance of John and Mary, who were inadvertently brought together by Wally, very subtly embodying the reference from Hello Dolly's role of matchmaker in that film. There's a beautiful narrative backdrop in this scene which acts as a kind of third romance. The now inspired and curious captain learns about human behaviour and dancing in particular, and this very different kind of infatuation helps to enforce a sense of wonder in the waltz. The clean, precise bass guitar staccato line returns, accompanied by a very subtle, almost lap steel-like texture. It's very delicate, but it's very contemporary. The piece is written in 3/4 time, quite directly referencing the waltz and the lightness, or in this case, weightlessness of the dance. The chordal movement between D-flat major and E-flat major provides us with a modal tonality of D-flat Lydian. The major third degree of G in the E-flat major chord acts as a sharpened fourth degree of the root of D-flat major. The satisfying release of tension in the Lydian mode's resolution from sharpened fourth to natural fifth has been used all throughout cinema's history for its mysticism and sense of longing. Maria! I got a few days left! And Newman is certainly not immune to its allure. In an interesting parallel, the Hello Dolly number Dancing, where Cornelius and Barnaby learn to dance, was originally considered for this scene as yet another quotation from that narrative. Its absence here, on one hand, could be due to Stanton's very public difficulties in securing the rights from what was then 20th Century Fox, or perhaps an original score's very bespoke ability to create new emotional affect for the audience was preferred over borrowing from Hello Dolly for the third time. All we know is what we had, and Newman's original score here is enchanting and very effective, particularly as it builds upon the identity that's encoded within Eve's theme. The ultimate resolution of this romantic tension occurs in the final scenes, where we believe Wally's injuries may mean that he has lost his memories for good, including all his memories of Eve, tragically, just as she's begun to reciprocate his affections fully. The salvation of the human race here is a completely secondary, subordinate narrative, as all narrative importance is placed on what we now know to be a love story. Stanton and Newman again decide to close out the picture as we started it with a quotation of Herman's music, and this time with the final measures of the love song, It Only Takes a Moment. Eve hums it to Wally with quiet despair, only for his memory to return as they finally get to clasp hands, as the full cue can play out again on harp and strings, but this time Herman's. The musical quotation helps answer the question of the hand-holding gesture that's been asked constantly throughout the film, and it ends with the perfect lyrical distillation of Wally and Eve's feelings for one another. And that is all that love's about, and we'll recall when time runs out that it only took a moment to be loved a whole life long. The very humble act of a composer taking a backseat to a quotation of existing music or a needle drop can be as emotionally effective as any compositional decision. It's the decision to remove one's own voice to serve the wider purpose of the film. And it's a beautiful example of the collaborative nature of multiple different departments coming together to synergistically or alchemically create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. Newman's marriage of conventional scoring techniques with very modern and novel ideas helped to modernize a romance which, in a very futuristic film, had its foundations in the nostalgic and the bygone. And in doing so, he expands the compositional toolset for future composers through the audience's new familiarity with these new devices. He's gone on to score a further 2 films for Pixar so far, and it's evident from his work on WALL-E that his ability to ascribe not just animated characters, but animated robotic characters with these very human emotions and experiences is testament to his abilities as a composer. So stick around for part 2, where we will be kind of unpacking his cue, The Axiom, from WALL-E's initial flight away from Earth to the ship, and we'll have a look at some of these devices and techniques in much closer detail. So, on to part 2. Okay, so this is my logic session for The Axiom, or maybe just Axiom, I'm not actually 100% sure. But it's this really lovely cue that we've already talked about when WALL-E leaves Earth for the first time. So I'll just play it all the way through, just like last time, and then we'll talk about a few little bits of interest. So this is my recreation of The Axiom. So yeah, really lovely cue. Lots happens as well. There's lots of kind of delicateness and richness as well. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was this brass section, which is really, really kind of muscular later on. There's the very subtle conversation between WALL-E's kind of lone courage and just the scale and magnitude of the axiom. And then there's that major minor dissonance, which has a lot of attitude and drama, I guess. So I think it starts about here. So we've got the lower two lines in the horns and the top line of the trombones playing almost like power chords, like these constant fifths that stay as fifths and playing up and down, almost like you're playing them on guitar. And then you've also got this major third to minor third thing happening in the top lines of the horns, and also octave in horns as well. And it just gives it a really big kind of attitude. And we can see visually on the piano roll as well how much of the kind of sonic frequency spectrum it's filling. So it's almost like a mixing consideration within orchestration. Then it lands on that big major down there. And then the second time around we have longer, more kind of drawn out chords. Then there's this huge major minor clash here. Let's have a listen to that. That harmonic shift gives it some uncertainty, and it makes us kind of second guess about the axiom, makes us a little bit suspicious of it. So another thing I wanted to talk about as well was the really lovely string line here. And there's this really subtle counterpoint that happens, and it's almost like a repetition of the line that's already happening. I think it's bar 15. Really lovely. So violin 1 is doing this kind of dotted segment here, and then violin 2 just follows 2 beats later. It's almost like a delay that you would do in mixing in a slightly different rhythmic pattern, but it's the same melodic movement, but it just adds this kind of texture. It just fills out the space a little bit. And I'm not well researched on my counterpoint, but I think this violin 2 then is kind of homophonic with the viola and the cello movement there. And again, this is in the piano roll. It's such a good resource to have if you don't read music like me, because you can really see the widening of the orchestration of this string choir here as we're doing that modulation using the 5th chord of the new key. So we start here on chords 4, 5, 6, and then go 6, 5, and then 5 of the new key on that G major, and then down into the C major. And we're using the full range all the way from the very bottom of the contrabasses, that's C0, all the way up to this soaring high G there, which is the 5th of the C major key center. So it's really kind of bunched up a little bit here, and then it's just slowly expanding as we go to that modulation, just in time for that shot of the sun and the probe spacecraft going across with that beautiful sun flare. And there's this really, I'm not sure how conventional it is in sci-fi, but I've definitely spotted a pattern in sci-fi where we have this augmented 5th. I think it was used in Signs quite a lot, and it just adds this really mysterious, sciencey, spacey, alien-y vibe. I think it was used in E.T. as well. So it's not like an ominous sci-fi-ness, it's like a friendly kind of sci-fi-ness and like an awe sense of feeling. Really lovely. So just on a kind of MIDI programming standpoint, the modulation down to the B flat major key center that happens a little bit later on, the string library I was using doesn't actually extend that low. So I'm not sure if when recording that live, you would use kind of a detuning switch or peg, whatever it is on the contrabass. But to be able to program it here, I actually detuned the sample library by a tone, and then transposed the piano roll and the MIDI signal up a tone. So it allowed me to play in what I'm hearing, a low, I think, B flat -1 note here. It's very quiet here, but... So, which obviously the contrabasses can't play in the sample library I was using, at least. So in transposing this piano roll up, it allows me to play in what I want to hear. It tells the sample library to play a tone up, and then the detuning of the sample library then plays a tone down. So the contact instance thinks it's a C, and then the sample library turns that C down into a B flat. So it allows you to kind of play what you see, even if your sample library doesn't allow you to go down that far. And that transpose function is really nicely in the Logic Inspector. I don't know if it's always been there, but I've spotted it recently and it's kind of comes in handy, as does the delay function. There's a delay function in the inspector where you can actually pull back as well to have negative delay, so it kind of plays it before when you played it. So yeah, you can actually give it a millisecond delay in negative space. So particularly with legato patches in lots of string sample libraries, there can be a little bit of latency as it's playing the sample for the transition from one note to another. And a lot of people compensate for that by just taking every note in the piano roll and moving it back a little bit, so that by the time the full expression of that sample has peaked, it's kind of then on the note, so it feels more quantized. It feels late if you have it perfectly quantized to the bar, but if you're happy with that kind of internal rigidity but you just need it all moved backwards and you still wanted to keep the quantizing functions, then you can use that delay feature just to pull everything back on like a MIDI level while still having it all nice and quantized in the piano roll, which can be really useful. So the opening moment as well, I wanted to just quickly mention, because I didn't really initially think of it, but the use of kind of metallic percussion here when he has all of the little satellites and Sputnik, he's revealed from behind Sputnik and they all just really delicately float off. And I think to use metallic percussion there, like triangle, glockenspiel, celeste or celeste, it's almost adds like a kind of diegetic moment where you could almost make the connection that it's coming from within the sound world, even though it's in space and it's a largely silent scene. It just adds that almost like sound design element through what would actually be a really old-fashioned scoring technique back from when in picture houses before there was synchronized audio. A live organist with all of these different instruments around him would or her would kind of mimic or Mickey Mouse the action on the screen, and that's an apt thing for animation, I think, just to harken back to that slightly. It's really cute. And that kind of flute alludes to that Newman sense of awe as well, which is really lovely. The harp transitions I wanted to mention because these function to give that like classical element of shifting from one scene to another or one shot to another. But it's describing the movement of the frame to a new one, but also what's happening within the frame as well, particularly around the sunspot kind of solar flare one. I think it'd be really easy to overuse that kind of transitionary effect of a harp gliss, particularly with its connotations of, you know, like a dream sequence or whatever, but it can be really effective, particularly if it's really embedded in the mix with this huge, rich orchestration that's happening around it. It just adds that little icing on the cake of that transition effect. And I feel like the harp also now being associated with this weightlessness and lightness and levity of Wally in space, weightless, it kind of foreshadows the waltz later on a little bit with Eve, because we've almost kind of associated harp and harp gliss with this lightness and weightlessness in space, which Newman can then reference later on. That's a really nice description of the kind of spiral swirling pattern there in the harp gliss. Really lovely. So I didn't think I was going to be able to mimic that texture that he has in the original track here. Goes from the left channel to the right, or I don't know, in Atmos it would probably be floating over your head, but I think it's a psaltery. I don't think you say that initial P. But yeah, it's just automating a little bit of a tremolo effect on the actual channel and shoving the high frequencies really high up because it's quite a sharp sound compared to the sample that I had. But I think in context, it kind of does work. It could perhaps have a little bit more sustain, but when you're doing a mock-up, you are restricted by what samples you have, I guess. And I don't think many people have a psaltery lying around. So yeah, that's just one of my favorite cues from the whole film. It's really beautiful. I'm sure there's far more to talk about harmonically, but we did cover a lot in the last one, particularly on modulation, and that was discussed in the essay quite a bit as well. So thank you if you've got this far. As always, like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can get notified when I drop the next one. I've got a couple more scores in mind for the next episodes. I'm not sure which one I want to drop next, so I'll have a little think about that. So if you've liked what you've seen so far, please pop back and we can carry on discussing some of what makes these film scores really, really great. So see you at the next one.